Oh, hello there, dear. Come in, come in. Don't just stand there hesitating. There's always a spare cup and a warm pot of tea here for you. Find a comfortable spot. That armchair by the window is lovely, catches the afternoon sun just right. There we are. Now, let me just. There, 2 sugars, for me, you know. Always has been, always will be. Some things just stick with you. You know, I was just sitting here, watching the steam curl up from my cup, and it reminded me of something. It's funny, isn't it, how a simple thing like a bit of steam, or the scent of rain on dry pavement, can just pull you back through the years, faster than any train could ever travel. My mind, these days, it's a bit like a cluttered old attic, full of memories, some dusty and forgotten in corners, others polished and sitting right in the middle. Catching the light, I was just looking at this old thing. She reaches for a small, tarnished silver locket resting on the table beside the tea set. It's not much to look at now, I suppose. The shine's long gone, and there's a little dent on the side here. See, but this locket. Oh, this locket holds the beginning of a story that shaped my entire life. It was given to me by my mother on my 16th birthday, just after the war. The world was trying to find its footing again, trying to remember how to be bright and hopeful, and I was just a girl, trying to figure out my own small place in it all. The inscription inside, it's almost worn away now, but it says, "Leap, and the net will appear." A hopeful thought, wasn't it? For a world that had seen so much falling without a net. My mother, she was full of sayings like that, little pockets of wisdom she'd hand out like sweets. I didn't understand the weight of those words then. To me, it was just a pretty piece of jewelry. I hadn't learned yet that some leaps are taken for you, and you just have to pray the net is strong enough. It all started on a Tuesday. I remember that because Tuesdays were washing days, and the air in our little terraced house in Liverpool always smelled of damp linen and carbolic soap. It was 1958, I was 21, and I thought I had my life all mapped out. I was engaged to a young man named Arthur, a good man, a steady man. He worked at the docks, just like my father did. He was predictable, you know, like the tide. You always knew where you stood with Arthur. Our life together was meant to be simple. A small house, a couple of children, Sunday roasts, and growing old in familiar chairs. It was a perfectly sensible, perfectly safe plan. But life, oh dear, life rarely cares for sensible plans. It has a way of scribbling in the margins, doesn't it? That particular Tuesday, the postman brought a letter. It wasn't for my ma'am, or my dad. It was for me. And the postmark wasn't from anywhere in England. It was from America, Chicago, Illinois, to be precise. My heart did a funny little flutter kick in my chest. We didn't know anyone in America. It felt as exotic and as far away as the moon. My hands trembled a bit as I opened it. The paper was different, thicker, creamier than our wartime shortage paper, and the handwriting. It was a confident, looping script, unfamiliar and bold. The letter was from a woman named Eleanor Vance, my mother's sister, my aunt, an aunt I never knew I had. You see, my mother, God rest her soul, she never spoke of her family. I knew she was an orphan, or at least, that's what I'd always been told, that she'd been raised in a children's home. It was a sad story, one you didn't poke at. It was a closed door in the hallway of our lives, and we all just learned to walk past it without trying the handle. This letter, it blew that door right off its hinges. Eleanor wrote that she and my mother had been separated as children, sent to different homes, then different countries as part of a child migrant program nobody ever spoke about. A scheme to send British children to the colonies and dominions. Eleanor had ended up with a family in Canada, who later moved to Chicago. She had spent decades, she wrote, decades searching for her sister, my mother. She'd only just found a record, a clue that led her to our address in Liverpool. The most important part, the part that made the whole room feel like it was tilting, was this: their mother, my grandmother, hadn't died when they were children. She had been alive all that time. She had fought to get her children back, but the bureaucracy, the sheer, unfeeling machinery of the state, had defeated her. She had passed away only a few years prior, leaving behind a small inheritance, and a house in a place I'd never heard of, a tiny village on the coast of Ireland, a place called Carrowkeel. The letter was an invitation, and a plea. Eleanor was too frail to travel herself. She wanted me to go, to see the house, to uncover the story of the grandmother I never knew. She had enclosed a ticket for the ferry to Dublin, and from there, a train ticket to the west of Ireland, and she'd sent some American dollars, which looked like play money to me. Enough, she said, to see me through the journey. I remember standing in our little kitchen, the smell of soap and boiled cabbage thick in the air. The letter felt like a hot coal in my hand. Arthur was due for his tea in an hour. Our life, our sensible, predictable life, was waiting. But this letter, this was a door to a past I never knew I had. It was a story with my name on the cover, and I hadn't even known it existed. My mother came in then, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw my face, saw the letter, and her expression just crumpled, like a piece of paper you squeeze in your fist. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was a deep, ancient weariness. I always knew this day might come, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking clock. And for the first time, I saw her not as my ma'am, but as a little girl who had lost her sister, her mother, her home, all in one go. Arthur, when I told him, he just didn't understand. Ireland. What's in Ireland? Our life is here, Rose. He held my hands, his own calloused and steady. Don't go chasing ghosts. What's done is done. He was trying to protect me, trying to keep our little world safe and sealed, but the seal was already broken. The letter had let the world in, or perhaps it had let me out. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, looking out at the dark, soot-stained rooftops of our street. The Locket cool against my skin. Leap, and the net will appear. The words echoed in my head. Was this the leap? Leaving behind everything I knew, a steady future with a good man, for a past I couldn't even imagine. Chasing the ghost of a grandmother in a country I'd never seen, it felt like madness. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in the fog. But deep down, in a place I hadn't known was there, a little spark of something was flickering to life. It wasn't just about finding a house, or an inheritance. It was about finding the missing pieces of my own story, of my mother's story. And I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic and all sensible plans, that if I didn't go, I would spend the rest of my life wondering. And that seemed a far greater risk than anything Ireland could throw at me. So, what do you think I did? The decision, once made, felt less like a choice and more like a current I'd been swept into. Telling Arthur was the hardest part. He stood there on our doorstep, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. I'll wait for you, Rose, he said. But his eyes told a different story. They said, the person who comes back won't be the person who left. And he was right, of course. He was always so sensible. My ma'am, though, was different. After the initial shock, a quiet resolve settled over her. It was as if a part of her that had been dormant for 40 years had finally stirred. She packed a small case for me, not with practical things, but with talismans, her own mother's rosary, beads, a tartan travel rug, and a small, heavy fruitcake wrapped in graceproof paper. You'll need your strength, she said, her voice firm, but her hands trembled as she fastened the straps of the case. It was an unspoken mission we were on now, a pilgrimage she couldn't make but was sending me on in her stead. The journey itself was a blur of new and overwhelming sensations. The ferry from Liverpool was a behemoth, groaning and shuddering as it pulled away from the familiar docks. I stood on the deck, the wind whipping my hair, tasting salt on my lips for the first time. The city I had known my entire life, with its soot-blackened spires and endless rows of houses, shrank until it was just a smudge on the horizon. I felt a pang of terror so sharp it took my breath away. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I clutched the locket in my pocket. Its familiar shape, a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Ireland was green, oh such a green, 100 different shades of it, from the emerald of the fields to the dark, mossy green of the stone walls that sliced across the landscape like stitches. It was a wild, untamed beauty, so different from the industrial gray of home. The train from Dublin chugged its way west, its rhythmic clatter a soundtrack to the rolling hills and brooding mountains outside my window. The other passengers spoke with a soft, musical lilt that was like a foreign language to my scouse ears. They were kind, though, sharing their flasks of tea and slices of soda bread, their eyes full of a gentle curiosity about the English girl traveling alone. The final leg of the journey was on a bus that rattled and coughed its way along roads so narrow I was sure we would scrape the ancient stone walls on either side. The driver, a ruddy-faced man named Seamus, seemed to know everyone in every village we passed through. He'd shout greetings, pass on messages, and even deliver a parcel or two. When I told him I was going to Karakil, he gave me a long look in his rearview mirror. Karakil is it now, he said, his voice a low rumble. Not many visitors go out that way, not anymore. It'll be the old Vance place you're looking for, I'd wager. I nodded, my heart thumping. Yes, that's it. Did you know the family knew of him? He said, turning his attention back to the winding road. Everyone knew of the Vances, a sad story, that one, a house with long shadows. He didn't say any more, and I didn't dare to ask. The other passengers fell quiet, and the only sound was the rattling of the bus and the bleating of sheep on a distant hill. The landscape grew wilder, the mountains, looming closer, their peaks shrouded in a soft, grey mist. The sea appeared, a dramatic slash of silver blue against the dark land, crashing against cliffs with a raw power that both thrilled and frightened me. Finally, Seamus pulled the bus to a stop at a crossroads. There was nothing there but a weathered signpost pointing down a narrow lane. Seed Karakil, it read. This is as far as I go, lass, he said, hoisting my case down. The house is about a mile down that lane. You can't miss it. It's the last one before the sea. He looked at me, his expression softening. You've a kind face. Be careful. Now, old houses hold old memories. Not all of them are friendly. And then he was gone, the bus rattling away into the distance, leaving me in a profound and unnerving silence. It was a silence unlike any I had ever known. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was a presence. It was filled with the sigh of the wind through the tall grasses, the distant cry of a seabird, and the low, constant hum of the ocean. The air smelled of salt, damp earth, and something else, something wild and floral, like honey. I picked up my case and started to walk. The lane was more of a track, overgrown with ferns and wildflowers I didn't recognize. The stone walls on either side were covered in moss and lichen, looking as if they had grown out of the earth itself. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. It stood at the end of the lane, silhouetted against the vast, gray sky and the churning sea. It wasn't a grand house, but it was sturdy, built of the same dark stone as the walls. 2 stories high, with a slate roof that was sagging in places and windows like vacant eyes. A gnarled, windswept tree stood beside it, its branches bent into a permanent bow by the relentless Atlantic wind. Seamus was right. It was a house with long shadows, even in the middle of the day. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached. A low stone wall enclosed a small, overgrown garden where roses had gone wild, their thorny branches tangled with weeds. The gate groaned in protest as I pushed it open. I walked up the cracked path to the front door. It was painted a shade of blue that had long since faded and peeled, blistered by years of salt and sun. The brass doorknob was green with verdigris. There was no key, just a heavy iron latch. I took a deep breath, the salty air filling my lungs. This was it. The house my grandmother had lived in, the home my mother had been taken from. I placed my hand on the cold iron of the latch, the metal gritty beneath my fingers. For a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back down that lane and catch the next bus, the next train, the next ferry, all the way back to the predictable safety of Arthur and my little Liverpool street, back to the life that made sense. But then I thought of my mother, of the quiet sadness she had carried for 40 years. I thought of the woman who had spent decades searching for her sister. And I thought of the ghost of my grandmother, a woman I had never met but whose blood ran in my veins. This was their story, and now it was mine too. I pushed down on the latch. With a deep, groaning sound that echoed in the profound silence, the salt-stained door swung inward, opening into darkness. What secrets were waiting inside? The air that rushed out to meet me was thick and musty, the scent of a place that had been sealed for a very long time. It was a complex smell, a layered history of peat smoke, dried herbs, damp stone, and the faintest, ghostly trace of lavender. I stood on the threshold, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. Sunlight struggled to pierce the grimy window panes, casting long, dusty fingers of light across the room. It was like stepping into a photograph. Everything was covered in a fine, gray shroud of dust, a blanket of forgotten years. To the left was a small sitting room, dominated by a huge, black stone fireplace. A turf bucket, still holding a few dried sods of peat, sat on the hearth. A backed armchair, its floral pattern faded to a pale ghost of its former self, was angled towards the cold fireplace, as if its occupant had just gotten up and would be back in a moment. On a small, rickety table beside it, a book lay open, its pages yellowed and curled. I walked further in, my footsteps unnervingly loud on the stone-flagged floor. Every surface was a time capsule. On the mantelpiece, a collection of mismatched china dogs stood guard, their painted eyes staring blankly into the room. A tarnished silver-backed brush and comb set lay next to them, a few long, dark hairs still caught in the bristles. My grandmother's hair. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a house, it was an intimate, personal space, and I felt like an intruder, a trespasser on a life that had ended long ago. The kitchen was at the back of the house. A simple, rustic room. A huge cast-iron range stood cold and silent. Copper pots, blackened with soot, hung from a rack on the wall. On a wooden dresser, blue and white patterned plates were stacked neatly, each one separated from the next by the thinnest layer of dust, as if the owner had been meticulously tidy. A wave of profound sadness washed over me. This was the heart of the home, the place where my grandmother would have cooked and hummed, and perhaps watched her two little girls playing on the floor, my mother and my Aunt Eleanor. It was here that their lives had been torn apart. I found myself drawn to the sitting room again, to the open book on the table. I gently picked it up, blowing a cloud of dust from its cover. It was a collection of Irish poetry. The pages felt brittle, fragile. As I turned it over, a small, pressed flower fell from between the pages and drifted to the floor. A forget-me-not, its blue color miraculously preserved. A lump formed in my throat. By the way, dear, this story is taking me so far back. It makes me wonder about you. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? It feels like we're sharing this pot of tea across the miles and the years. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. It makes the world feel a little smaller, a little cozier, you know. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, the house. The loneliness of the place was beginning to seep into my bones. It was a heavy, oppressive feeling. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was watchful. I decided I needed to let some air in, to chase away the ghosts, if only for a little while. I went to the front window and struggled with the sash. It was stuck fast with age and damp. Finally, with a great heave and a screech of protest from the wood, it shot upwards. Fresh, salty air flooded the room, and with it, the sound of the sea, louder and more insistent now. The light, brighter and clearer, illuminated the dust motes in a frantic, swirling dance. It also revealed something I hadn't seen before. On the wall opposite the fireplace, hanging slightly askew, was a collection of framed pictures. My breath caught in my chest. I wiped the glass of the largest one with the sleeve of my cardigan. It was a formal family portrait, a man with a serious face and kind eyes, and a woman with a gentle smile and dark, wavy hair, so much like my mother's. And standing in front of them, two little girls in matching white dresses, their arms linked. They couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. One had my mother's dark hair, the other was fairer, with a mischievous glint in her eye. My mother and Eleanor, and my grandparents. It was the first time I had ever seen their faces. I sank into the dusty armchair, my legs suddenly weak. I stared at the photograph, at the happy, unsuspecting family, frozen in time. What happened to you? I whispered to the silent room. What broke this family apart? The man, my grandfather, must have passed away, but my grandmother, she had lived on, alone in this house. Why? Why didn't she have her children with her? The answer, or the beginning of it, was in a small wooden chest, tucked under the window. It wasn't locked. I lifted the heavy lid, and the scent of cedarwood and old paper filled the air. It was filled with letters, bundled together with faded ribbon, and legal-looking documents, and newspaper clippings, all yellowed and brittle. My hands trembled as I lifted out the first bundle of letters. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. I read the first line. My dearest Thomas, it began. A letter from my grandmother, Mary, to my grandfather. It was a love letter, full of hope and plans for their future in this very house. Then, I found another bundle. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was different, desperate, pleading. They were letters addressed to someone at an official-looking address in Dublin. I am writing to you again regarding my children, Eleanor and Rose. It has been 6 months since they were taken into care following my husband's death and my subsequent illness. I am now fully recovered and can provide a safe and loving home for them. Another letter, dated a year later. I do not understand why I am being denied access. I have sent proof of my employment. The local doctor can attest to my health. Please, I beg of you, they are all I have in this world. A mother should not be separated from her children. And another, a stack of them. A mother's heart poured out onto paper. Her words were full of anguish, of a rising panic, of a dawning, horrified understanding that a faceless, bureaucratic system was stealing her daughters. And then I found the official replies, cold, formal, dismissive, regret to inform you, in the children's best interest. The decision is final. The final piece of the puzzle was a newspaper clipping from 1948. The headline read, "Orphaned and Unwanted. Britain's child migrants find new hope overseas." It was a propaganda piece, extolling the virtues of the scheme that had sent my mother to a children's home in England and my aunt to Canada, painting it as an act of charity. It didn't mention the mothers, like Mary Vance, who were very much alive and fighting, their cries for their children lost in a sea of red tape. The full weight of the tragedy settled upon me. My grandmother hadn't abandoned her children. She had been robbed of them, and she had spent the rest of her life here, in this house full of memories, surrounded by their photographs, writing letters that were never answered, her heart breaking over and over again. The house wasn't just holding memories, it was a monument to a grief so profound I could feel it in the very stones around me. The ticking clock from my own home seemed a world away. Here, time had stopped. How could a person endure such a loss and keep on living? The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in dramatic strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it was lost on me. I sat there in the fading light, the letters and documents spread on my lap like a fan of sorrows. The story they told was so immense, so cruel, it felt like a physical weight. My grandmother, Mary, had been a victim of a terrible injustice, a footnote in a forgotten chapter of history, and my mother and Eleanor were victims too, growing up believing they were orphans, their identities erased, their connection to each other and their home severed. A deep, cold anger began to smolder inside me, replacing the initial shock and sadness, an anger at the faceless officials who had wielded their power with such casual cruelty, an anger at a system that could look at a grieving widow and see not a mother, but a problem to be solved by tearing her family apart. I thought of my own ma'am, how she rarely smiled with her whole face, how there was always a shadow of something sad in her eyes. I finally understood what that shadow was. It was the ghost of this house, of this mother she barely remembered. As darkness fell, so did the weather. The wind, which had been a constant sighing presence, began to howl. It rattled the window frames and moaned down the chimney. Rain began to lash against the glass, coming in sheets, driven by the gale. The sound of the sea turned from a rhythmic crash into a furious, thunderous roar. It felt as if the wildness of the landscape, the raw grief of the house itself, was being unleashed. I hadn't eaten since the slice of soda bread on the train, but hunger was a distant sensation. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. This house, which had felt lonely before, now felt haunted, not by spirits, but by the sheer force of the emotion that had been lived within its walls. I tried to light a candle I'd found on the mantelpiece, my hands shaking so much it took several attempts. The small flame flickered and danced, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to leap and twist in the corners of the room. The storm outside mirrored the tempest in my own heart. I was stranded in this house of sorrow, stranded in a story I was only just beginning to understand. All my certainties had been washed away. The life I'd left behind in Liverpool, with its predictable rhythms and its simple clear-cut future with Arthur, seemed like a dream from another lifetime. It was a safe, warm room, and I had willingly stepped out of it into this raging storm. Why? What had I been thinking? Fear, cold and sharp, began to creep in. The bus driver's words came back to me. Old houses hold old memories. Not all of them are friendly. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to run out into the storm, anywhere but here. But where would I go? The lane would be a river of mud. The crossroads were miles away. There was no escape. I was trapped here, with the ghosts of the Vance family. I pulled the heavy tartan rug my ma'am had packed for me around my shoulders and curled up in the dusty armchair, the one my grandmother had sat in. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind, made me jump. I thought about Mary, My grandmother. Did she sit in this very chair, on stormy nights like this? Did she listen to the wind and the sea and feel the same profound, crushing loneliness? But her loneliness would have been 1,000 times worse than mine. I was just a visitor to this sorrow. She had lived it, breathed it, for decades. How did she survive? How did she get up each morning in this house, surrounded by the phantoms of her stolen children, and find a reason to keep going? I looked at the letters again, the ones she had written. The early ones were full of fight, of a fierce maternal love that refused to be extinguished. But the later ones, the ink seemed fainter, the handwriting less steady. The fight had slowly drained away, replaced by a quiet, heartbreaking resignation. Sometime in the deepest, darkest part of the night, when the storm was at its most ferocious, I must have drifted into a fitful, dream-haunted sleep. I dreamt I was a little girl again, lost in a vast, echoing train station. I was calling for my mother, but my voice made no sound. People rushed past me, their faces blank and uncaring. Then, through the crowd, I saw a woman with kind eyes and dark, wavy hair. She was holding out her hand to me. "Mary," I whispered in the dream, "my grandmother." I tried to run towards her, but my legs were made of lead. The crowd thickened, and she was gone. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The storm had begun to subside. The rain was softer now, a gentle drumming on the roof. The wind had quieted to a low whistle, and in the sudden lull, I heard a new sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from upstairs. My blood ran cold. The house was supposed to be empty. I was supposed to be alone. I sat bolt upright, every muscle tense, straining my ears in the near-silence. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap. It was steady, deliberate, not the random creak of an old house settling. It was the sound of something, or someone. A fresh wave of terror washed over me. All the rational explanations, loose shutter, a branch against a window fled from my mind, replaced by a primal fear of the unknown. The house had felt watchful, and now it felt occupied. Was this the unfriendly memory the bus driver had warned me about? I had come here seeking answers, but had I woken something that should have been left to sleep in the dust? Forcing myself to my feet, I knew I had to find the source of the sound. I couldn't just sit here, cowering in the dark. My feet felt like lead weights as I forced them to move towards the bottom of the staircase. The stairs were narrow and steep, disappearing into the oppressive darkness of the upper floor. The candle flame in my trembling hand threw my own shadow. Up the wall ahead of me, a giant, distorted figure that seemed to mock my fear. Every step I took on the creaking wood was a battle against my own screaming nerves. The tapping sound continued, a steady, patient rhythm from somewhere above. Tap, tap, tap. I reached the small landing. There were 2 doors, both closed. The tapping seemed to be coming from behind the door on the right. I stood before it for a long moment, my ear pressed against the cold wood. The sound was clearer now. It wasn't menacing. It was methodical. It sounded like something tapping against glass. Taking a breath that did little to calm my racing heart, I turned the old brass knob and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing a small, simple bedroom. The room was almost bare. A narrow iron bedstead with a thin, lumpy mattress, a small wooden wardrobe, and a window, its glass streaked with rain, looking out over the raging sea. And that's where the sound was coming from. A small branch from the gnarled tree outside, tossed about by the storm, was rhythmically tapping against the windowpane. Tap, tap, tap. Relief washed over me so intensely my knees felt weak. I almost laughed out loud at my own foolishness. A branch, of course, it was a branch. I had let the grief of the house and the violence of the storm conjure up all sorts of terrors. I walked over to the window and looked out. The sea was still, a churning mass of gray, but the worst of the storm had passed. The moon broke through the clouds for a moment, casting a pale, silvery light on the water. As I turned from the window, the candlelight caught something on the wall beside the wardrobe. It was a faint outline, a rectangle shape that was slightly different in texture from the rest of the faded, peeling wallpaper. It looked newer, like a patch. Curiosity, now stronger than my fear, took over. I ran my fingers over it. The wallpaper here was smooth, not bubbled and peeling like the rest. Underneath, the wall felt hollowed. That my heart began to thump again, but this time with anticipation, not terror. I used my fingernails to pick at the edge of the wallpaper. It came away easily, tearing in a long strip to reveal not plaster, but a small, square wooden panel. It wasn't nailed shut. It looked like it was designed to be opened. I wedged my fingers into a small gap at the side and pulled. It came away with a soft pop, revealing a dark, recessed space within the thick stone wall. A secret compartment. Reaching inside, my fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. I drew it out. It was a small, tin box, the kind that might once have held biscuits or sweets. It was rusted around the edges, but heavy. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton wool, was not a treasure of gold or jewels, but something far more precious. It was a collection of small, handmade objects, tiny wooden animals, whittled with care, a little doll made from scraps of cloth, with yarn for hair and buttons for eyes, a child's drawing of a house with a smiling sun, the very house I was standing in. And there were more letters. These were different from the official letters. Downstairs, these were written on scraps of paper, the backs of envelopes, anything that could be found. The handwriting was my grandmother's, but it was different. It was filled not with despair, but with a fierce, unbreakable love. My dearest Eleanor, my dearest Rose, the first one began. I hope this finds you, wherever you are. I don't know if you will ever read these words, but I have to write them. I have to tell you that not a day goes by, not an hour, that I do not think of you. I see your faces in my dreams. I hear your laughter on the wind. They tell me you are better off, that you are in new homes, with new families, but a mother knows her own heart, and my heart knows it is broken without you. I want you to know you were not abandoned, you were loved fiercely. There were dozens of them. A chronicle of a mother's love, written into the silence, posted into a void. She had written them year after year, on their birthdays, at Christmas. She told them about the village, about the changing seasons, about the flowers in her garden. She told them stories she remembered from when they were small. She was keeping their memory alive, keeping her connection to them alive, in the only way she could. And then I found the last thing in the box. It was a small, leather-bound journal, her diary. The first entry was dated just a week after she had received the final official letter, telling her the decision was irreversible. I expected the pages to be filled with anger, with bitterness, with despair, and those things were there, in the beginning. She wrote of the emptiness of the house, of the silence that screamed her daughters' names. She wrote of her rage at the injustice, her feeling of utter powerlessness. But then, as I read on, the tone began to shift. It was a slow, almost imperceptible change. She wrote about planting a garden. I will plant a rose for Rose, and for Eleanor, I will plant the blue forget-me-nots she loved so much. If they cannot be here, then their memory will bloom. She wrote about starting to help her neighbors, mending clothes for a family whose mother was ill, bringing soup to an elderly man down the lane. She began to find a purpose, not in fighting the system that had broken her, but in pouring her love, the love she could no longer give to her daughters, out into the world around her. She found a strength she never knew she possessed, not a strength that denied her grief, but one that learned to carry it. Grief, she wrote in one of the later entries, is not a hole to be filled. It is a weight to be carried. And in learning to carry it, you find your own strength. You learn that a heart can be broken and still beat. It can be shattered and still love. This was the turning point. This was the secret of the house. It wasn't a place of haunting, but a place of healing. It wasn't a monument to grief, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. My grandmother, Mary, had faced the most unimaginable loss. She had been defeated, broken, and left alone. But she had not let bitterness consume her. She had chosen, day after day, to find a way to live, to love, to endure. She had found a quiet courage that was more powerful than any rage she had taken. Her leap, not into a void, but into a new understanding of life. And somehow, in this dark, forgotten house, she had built her own net. And reading her words, I felt its strength catching me. I must have sat on that floor reading for hours, the candle burning down to a stub, the first hints of dawn beginning to soften the black sky outside the window. The diary wasn't just a record of my grandmother's pain. It was a roadmap of her survival. It was a testament to a quiet, profound kind of courage that I had never considered before. Courage wasn't always about grand gestures and loud battles. Sometimes, it was about the simple, daily act of choosing hope over despair. It was planting a flower, mending a neighbor's coat, writing a letter that might never be read. It was about keeping a light on inside yourself, even when the world outside was dark. As I read the final entry, my hands were no longer shaking. A sense of peace, deep and resonant, had settled over me. The entry was dated just a few months before she passed away. Her handwriting was frail, but clear. "The doctor tells me my time is short," she wrote. "I am not afraid. This old house and I, we have kept each other company for a long time. It is full of memories, yes, but they are not all sad anymore. When I sit in my chair, I can almost feel my Thomas beside me. I can hear the girls laughing in the garden. I have lived a life I did not choose, but I have lived it with love. I do not know what will become of this place, or of my words hidden in the wall, but I have a sense, a feeling in my old bones, that one day they will find their way home. My love will find its way. It always does." Tears streamed down my face as I read those words, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of awe, of gratitude, of a deep and powerful connection to this woman I had never met. She had left me a legacy far more valuable than a house or an inheritance. She had left me her story, her strength. I carefully placed the diary and the letters back in the tin box. This was a treasure that needed to be shared. My mother had to read these words. Eleanor had to read them. They needed to know the truth of their mother's love. They needed to know they had not been forgotten. As the sun finally rose, it was a completely different world. The storm had washed the sky clean. It was a pale, luminous blue. The sea, no longer angry, was a gentle, swelling expanse of silver and gold. I pushed open the window properly, and the air that filled the room was fresh and clean, smelling of rain-washed earth and salt. The world felt new, reborn, and in a way, so did I. I spent the rest of the morning exploring the house again, but, with new eyes, I no longer saw it as a place of sorrow. I saw it as a place of incredible strength. I saw the worn armchair not as a symbol of loneliness, but of endurance. I saw the neat stacks of plates not as a sign of obsession, but of a woman creating order in a chaotic world. I saw the wild, overgrown garden not as neglect, but as a place where life, stubborn and beautiful, insisted on blooming. I found a pump in the kitchen and managed to get some rusty water flowing. I washed my face and hands, the cold water a shocking, welcome jolt. I ate the last of my mam's fruitcake, and it tasted like the most delicious thing I had ever eaten. I wasn't the same girl who had arrived here less than 24 hours ago. That girl was timid, afraid of stepping outside the neat lines of her life. She was defined by a future that had been planned for her. This new girl, the one standing in this sunlit Irish kitchen, was different. She was a girl who had found her past, and in doing so, had unlocked a future she couldn't yet imagine. Later that morning, as I was sweeping the dust and debris from the stone-flagged floor, I heard a sound from outside, not the rattling of a bus, but the gentle clip-clop of a horse's hooves. I went to the door and looked out. An elderly man was leading a pony and cart up the lane. He had a weathered, kind face, and eyes as blue as the sea behind him. "Mornin' to thee," he called out, his voice a soft, musical brogue. "I'm Fergal, I live down the lane. Saw the smoke from your candle last night in the storm. Thought I'd come and check you were all right. We don't get many visitors at the old Vance place." "I'm all right," I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. "Thank you for checking. I'm Rose, Mary's granddaughter." His eyes widened in surprise, and then a slow, warm smile spread across his face. "Mary's granddaughter," he repeated, his voice full of wonder. "Well, isn't that a blessing? A real blessing. Your grandmother, she was the heart of this place. The kindest soul you could ever hope to meet. We all missed her dearly when she passed." He told me stories about her, how she had nursed his wife through a bad fever, how she always had a spare scone for the children who passed by, how she would sit on her front wall and tell stories to anyone who had a moment to listen. He painted a picture of a woman who had turned her personal tragedy into a wellspring of communal love. He confirmed everything her diary had suggested. She hadn't just survived. She had triumphed, in her own quiet, unassuming way. I knew then what I had to do. This house wasn't a place to be sold or forgotten. It was a place to be brought back to life. It was a home, our home. I asked Fergal if he knew of anyone who could help me send a telegram. I needed to contact my Aunt Eleanor in Chicago, and then I needed to send one to my mam in Liverpool. My message to her was simple. Found her, it would say, "Come home." The journey back would be different. I was no longer running from a future, but towards one I was ready to build myself. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that this was just the beginning. The real work, the work of healing a family broken for nearly half a century, was about to begin. But for the first time, it felt not like a burden, but a privilege. The telegrams I sent out from the little post office in the next village felt like paper boats being pushed out into a vast ocean. I had no idea what ripples they would cause, or what shores they would reach. I returned to the house and waited. Waiting in that quiet space was different now. It wasn't the anxious, fearful waiting of that first night. It was a patient, hopeful vigil. I spent my days cleaning, airing out the rooms, tending to the wild garden as best I could. I pulled weeds from around the rose bush and the patch of forget-me-nots, feeling a profound connection to the woman who had planted them. With each weed I pulled, it felt like I was clearing away a piece of the old sorrow, making space for new growth. Fergal, my kind neighbor, would bring me fresh milk and bread, and in the evenings, he'd share more stories of my grandmother, each one another brushstroke in the portrait of her that was forming in my mind. About a week later, a reply came from Chicago. It was long and rambling, sent at great expense. Eleanor was overwhelmed, emotional, and overjoyed. She was too frail to make the journey herself, she confirmed, but she begged for details, for photographs, for any piece of the mother she barely remembered. She wrote, "You have given me back my past, Rose. You have given me back my mother's love." She also said she had sent a letter to my mother. The biggest change, however, came in the form of a rattling taxi, making its way down the lane about 2 weeks after I first arrived. I was outside, attempting to coax the rusty gate to swing without groaning, when it pulled up. The door opened, and my mother stepped out. She looked so different here, smaller, somehow, against the vast backdrop of the mountains and the sea. She was wearing her best coat, the one she wore for church on Sundays, and she clutched her handbag like a shield. She stood for a long moment, just staring at the house, her face pale, her expression unreadable. I walked slowly towards her. I didn't know what to say, what to do. Would she be angry? Would the memories be too painful? "Ma'am," I said softly. She looked at me, and her eyes, those sad eyes I knew so well, were filled with a tumult of emotions I couldn't begin to name. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, until she was standing at the edge of the overgrown path. She reached out and touched the gatepost, her fingers tracing the lichens that grew there. "I remember this," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from her before. "I remember the feel of this stone. I used to swing on this gate." And then the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart for 40 years crumbled. She leaned against the gatepost and began to weep, not quiet, reserved tears, but deep, wrenching sobs of a grief that had been held in for a lifetime. I went to her and put my arms around her, and she clung to me, her small body shaking. We stood there for a long time, mother and daughter, holding each other up as the sea breeze whispered through the grasses around us. That day, I didn't show her the diary. It was too soon. Instead, I made her a cup of tea on the old range, which I had finally figured out how to light with Fergal's help. We sat in the 2 armchairs in the sitting room, the ones I had pulled from other rooms to make the space feel less empty. And for the first time in my life, my mother began to talk. She shared fractured, half-remembered images, the smell of her mother's baking, the feel of her father's scratchy wool jumper, playing hide-and-seek with her sister, Eleanor, in the garden. They were like tiny, precious jewels she had kept hidden away, and now, in the safety of this house, she was finally able to bring them out into the light. She stayed for a week. We talked more in that week than we had in my entire life. I read her excerpts from the letters, the ones full of love and longing. I told her about Mary's quiet courage, her kindness to the neighbors, her garden. I was giving her back her mother, piece by piece, and in return, she was giving me back a part of herself I never knew existed. The shadow in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a soft, gentle light. The day before she was due to leave, I finally gave her the diary. She sat in the armchair by the window, the same one her mother had sat in, and read for hours, her face a study in concentration. When she finished, she closed the book, held it to her chest, and looked at me. "She never stopped loving us," she said, her voice full of a quiet wonder. "All this time, I thought we were forgotten." "No," I said, my own voice catching, "never forgotten." Before she left, We walked down to the edge of the cliffs overlooking the sea. The water was calm, sparkling in the sunlight. Arthur telephoned the house while you were gone, she said, not looking at me. He's a good man, Rose, a steady man. I know, ma'am, I said, but your life isn't there anymore, is it? She asked, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It wasn't a question of judgment, but of fact. No, I said, the single word holding a universe of meaning. I don't think it is. My leap had changed me. The net that had appeared was woven from threads of the past, but it was showing me the way to a different future. My ma'am went back to Liverpool to sort out her affairs. She wrote to Eleanor, and they began a frantic, emotional correspondence. Two sisters separated by an ocean and a lifetime, finally finding each other again through shared words and memories. A few months later, my mother returned to care for good, and I stayed. I helped my mother bring the house and the garden back to life. We painted the front door a bright, cheerful blue. We planted new flowers alongside my grandmother's stubborn roses. We became part of the small, warm community that had sustained Mary for so many years. I never did go back to Liverpool to live. I wrote to Arthur a long, difficult letter trying to explain the person I had become. He never wrote back. It was a sad, quiet ending to a life that no longer fit me. Like a coat I had outgrown, the grandmother in the present day takes a slow sip of her tea, a gentle, wistful smile on her face. The clock ticks on, a comforting, steady presence. You see, dear, that old Locket was right. Leap, and the net will appear. But the net isn't always what you expect. Sometimes, it's not a soft landing. Sometimes, it's a web of stories, of tangled threads of love and loss that you have to slowly, carefully, weave back together. My leap took me away from a safe, predictable life, yes, but it gave me back my family. It gave me back my history, and it taught me the most important lesson of all, that strength isn't about never falling, or never being broken. Oh dear, no. Life will break you, in ways big and small. Real strength, the kind that lasts, is about what you do after. It's about finding the courage to replant the garden, to write the letter, to mend the broken pieces of your heart, not so they are perfect, but so they are strong enough to keep beating, and strong enough to keep loving. It's about learning that even the deepest grief can be carried, and that love, like my grandmother's, will always, always find its way home. Now, how about another cup of tea?